I never thought I'd be here, telling my story, after growing up on the streets of the Bronx, a place that can be as cold and ruthless as it is welcoming. My childhood was nothing like other kids. While others played in parks or came home to dinner with their families, I learned early on that life doesn't always give you what you want or deserve. My name is Liz Murray, and I grew up in a family that, despite loving me, was trapped in the dark world of addiction and poverty. My home was a tiny apartment in the Bronx, where silence felt as heavy as the cracked walls that seemed to carry the stories of those who'd lived there before us. My parents were addicts, and my sister and I had to fend for ourselves, even though we were just kids. Hunger and need became a daily reality. There were days when the refrigerator was empty, and my sister and I would scavenge in trash cans or walk the streets looking for something that someone else had left behind. My parents, despite their limitations and addictions, tried to show us their love in their own way. I remember my mother as a kind person, though trapped in the endless cycle of addiction. She was my emotional refuge, the one person who made me feel that, despite everything, I was valuable. My father was charismatic and intelligent, with a brilliant mind that addiction and poverty slowly dimmed. But his love for me was undeniable, though sometimes it hurt to think that his love for drugs was even greater. As I grew up, things got worse. My mother contracted HIV, and her health began to deteriorate quickly. Each day I saw her grow weaker, more tired. Her body hunched over, and her eyes, once full of life, began to dim. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew I was losing her. At the same time, our home situation worsened. There was no money, no food, and our family seemed to be crumbling, slowly, like a house collapsing under the weight of neglect. When I was 15, my mother passed away. That day felt like the world stopped. I lost not only the one person who made me feel safe but also the last bit of stability in my life. From that moment on, I was completely alone. My father was trapped in his addiction, and I had nowhere to live, no one to turn to. That's when I began living on the streets, seeking shelter wherever I could find protection from the cold and the dark. The street is a relentless place. Surviving in a world where each day is a fight for the basics, a place to sleep, something to eat, a moment of peace, is no easy task. I slept on park benches, emergency stairwells, or on friends' couches when someone gave me a spot. I learned to be strong, to never show weakness, because on the street, any sign of vulnerability turns you into an easy target. There were nights when, despite my strength, I wondered if life would always be like this. I saw myself, a homeless teenager, without family, without a future. It was hard to imagine anything different. But in my darkest moments, I remembered something my mother used to tell me: your education is something no one can take away from you. Those words stayed in my mind like a small light in the darkness. I thought about them, and a tiny spark of hope began to grow. It was then that I decided that, against all odds, I would return to school. It seemed like an absurd, almost impossible idea, but I knew it was the only way to change my life. I showed up to high school in the same clothes every day, enduring the looks and whispers from other students. They knew I was the homeless girl, the one who had nowhere to sleep. I tried to ignore them and focused on my studies. I threw myself into my books as if they were my only way out of the pit I was in. Every day after classes, I studied in the library until it closed. I didn't have my own books, so I copied down whatever I could in my notebook. I memorized my notes and reviewed every lesson, obsessed with the idea that my only chance to move forward depended on my studies. My nights became a whirlwind of survival and dedication. After studying, I would look for a place to sleep, and day after day, I built a routine in the middle of nowhere. As I progressed in school, I began to excel academically. Some teachers noticed my effort and started offering their help. One of them told me about a scholarship for students in extreme circumstances, a scholarship that could completely change my life. I clung to that idea as if it were a lifeline. I worked tirelessly to meet all the requirements. I wrote essays about my life, my dreams, and how, despite everything, I still believed in a better future. I remember the day I received the response. I held the envelope in my hands, too scared to open it. I knew that piece of paper could change everything. Finally, I gathered the courage and opened it. The first word I saw was congratulations. I couldn't believe it. I had won the scholarship. At that moment, tears began streaming down my face. It wasn't just a scholarship, it was a new chance at life. That scholarship took me to Harvard. It was a radical change, as if I'd crossed an abyss from the streets of New York to the halls of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Adapting wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I didn't belong, that the contrast between my past and my present was too great. I looked at my classmates, who came from well-off families, with lives so different from mine, and felt like I would never fit in. But I always remembered where I came from and what I had overcome to get there. I knew I wasn't at Harvard just for myself but also for my mother and for all the people who had believed in me. Today, when I look back, I see a story of pain, sacrifice, but also hope and strength. I learned that even though the road is dark and full of obstacles, there is always a way out. Every small step, every decision brought me closer to the life I had always dreamed of. Because poverty and despair may be part of our story, but they don't have to be our destiny. This is my story. The story of a girl who refused to give up, who believed in a better future when everything seemed lost, and who now knows that even in the darkest moments, there is always a spark of light waiting to guide us.